All right. Um, Welcome back to the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle, C6. The first thing I'm going to do is just quickly review the nitrogen cycle again. So here's our nitrogen cycle, and we have all that atmospheric nitrogen that we or plants cannot really use. And that gets fixed by two different bacteria. So nitrogen fixation by azobacter, free-living bacteria in the soil, and rhizobium, which is associated with plant roots. And the fixation is when we go from the gas to the ammonia. And so here's our ammonia store. The other way that we can get ammonia is when plants and animals die and decompose or pee, their excretion through urea, and you get this ammonia. Now, the ammonia is going to be turned into nitrates, and that happens through nitrifying bacteria. So we go from ammonia to nitrates with two different nitrifying bacteria. So this is nitrification. It is a two-step process. We get to the nitrites and then to the nitrates by Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter. All right, so now once it's nitrate, then a few things can happen to it. One is the plants can absorb it, right? But it can also go through what's called denitrification, right? And that's when you get the denitrifying bacteria that turn the NO3 into the N2 gas, okay? And of course, we know that the plants and the animals get theirs from eating the plants, okay? All right, so we do things to screw up the nitrogen cycle. One, if you were to log this area, let's say we take the trees out of this ecosystem, you're going to lose a major storage of nitrogen in the plants and animals. So they can't die and it can't be recycled back into it. So the loss of a lot of nitrogen comes from the decaying plants and animals. So you basically take all that nitrogen that was fixed and you remove it from the area if you're logging it. That also happens when you harvest crops and other things. And you can see this is a graph showing the nitrate concentration in runoff. And the runoff means it's being taken away from a stream. So if you're looking at a stream that goes through a clear-cut area, there's not a lot of nitrates in the water because the plants absorb it all. But if you cut a whole bunch of trees down, then the nearby streams are going to be full of nitrates because there's no plants to absorb it anymore and it's not, in the soil. So you can see that a lot of nitrates get lost if you cut it down. We also add inorganic fertilizers, and these fertilizers, because there is a way, the Haber process, that we can actually turn atmospheric nitrogen into nitrates. So that's an actual man-made process. You probably learned about it in chemistry if you're taking that too. And so we can take that nitrate and put it all over the crops to get them to grow. One of the major problems with this, though, is that when it rains, that's going to run off into our bodies of water. We're going to come back to that when we look at eutrophication in a bit. This is what happens when that happens. That's eutrophication. And that's showing us dead zones because of eutrophication. Okay. Something interesting about the nitrogen cycle, too, is that waterlogged soils tend to be pretty lacking in nitrogen or in nitrates. And that's because the type of bacteria that really thrives in those are denitrifying bacteria. And so you don't actually get a lot of decay anyway because it's too acidic in peat bogs for things to break down, right? And so it's pretty acidic, so you're not getting a lot of decomposition. And you're also then, any nitrates that get formed, it'll be denitrified pretty quickly by that bacteria. So in waterlogged soils, there tends to not be a lot of nitrates. There is a species of plants, though, that has specialized to live in the bogs, and a lot of the carnivorous plants. And when you have a carnivorous plants, they still photosynthesize. They still make their food through photosynthesis, right? However, they still need nitrates. And the way they get their nitrogen to build those things with is by eating animals. And so this is a sundew, which lives in the bogs here in Europe. It's pretty amazing. Okay, phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus cycle, unlike the nitrogen cycle, there is no atmospheric component. So the phosphorus cycle is a geological cycle, and it's very slow compared to the nitrogen cycle, compared to the carbon cycle. It is glacial slow. And essentially there's a component in the soil between organisms dying and breaking down, and then you can also get some phosphorus from rocks, okay, and that can come back through uplift. But the way that we get our phosphorus is by eating food, other organisms. Okay. Again, I'm not going to spend time on this slide. You can pause it if you want, but it's a very slow process, right? And it tends to be pretty local. There's both aquatic and terrestrial parts in the ecosystem, but there's no atmospheric component, okay? So one major concern about the phosphorus cycle is because it's such a slow cycle, it's basically, it's not sustainable to use it to be able to mine it, because there's quite a bit of phosphorus that we get out of rocks, and that's how we get the fertilizers that we need to put on our plants, is we mine it from rocks. And there is a concern that we will have reached what's called peak phosphorus, and phosphorus will then be really limiting for us to use in agriculture. So if we run out of accessible phosphorus in the next 50 to 100 years, that could have a significant impact on our ability to grow crops, okay? Just looking again at the phosphorus cycle, again, it's just most of what we think of with the phosphorus cycle with plants and animals, it's just through decomposition and consuming, right? And then you can get bone deposits, that kind of turn into limestone and other things, and through weathering, you get more phosphates available for the plants, okay? But so there's really only two ways, through dead organisms and then through the weathering of rocks. And because we can go through it so quickly, so you can get, if you use organics, like breaking down or decomposing plant and animal matter on your crops, you can get phosphorus that way. But if you're trying to do it in bulk, the way we do in mass with industrialized agriculture, that's not enough. They want to put as much phosphorus on as they can. So that's where a lot of this gets mined from. Now, what happens when you put all of this inorganic phosphorus and nitrogen onto our crops is that all these inorganic fertilizers, is that when it rains, that can go, it runs off the land and gets into our bodies of water. And what happens there is called eutrophication. And eutrophication is essentially the excess boost of nutrients in a body of water. And all of a sudden you get a huge burst of algae growing, and that's why it looks so green. Now this algae is a pretty big deal. It blocks the sunlight, so the aquatic plants can't photosynthesize anymore, right? And so that reduces the oxygen. And then that means things die, so there's more dead organic matter. The algae at the bottom of the thick mat tends to die because it's not getting as much sun. That dies, right? And all of these things that are dying have to be decomposed. So the plants, that's them not photosynthesizing reduces the oxygen, but then that decomposition of everything by bacteria, because decomposition is cell respiration, that reduces more oxygen in the water. So this is a positive feedback loop. The more oxygen that gets taken out of the water, the more organisms die. The more organisms die, the more decomposition that has to happen, the more oxygen that gets taken out of the water. So essentially, all that lack of oxygen in the water leads to these hypoxic conditions, which are really terrible, and things can't grow there. So you get death of animals, this positive feedback loop. Dead zones, I showed you that picture of the dead zone when we were looking at off the coast of New Orleans. And then you need to be able to outline the process of eutrophication, and you have to be able to identify that positive feedback loop, okay? Last thing that's actually could be a really cool IA is measuring the biochemical oxygen demand, and that is the amount of dissolved oxygen needed to break down the organic material. So if you have a high biochemical oxygen demand, that means a lot of oxygen is necessary to break down the organic matter. So a high BOD indicates organic pollution. It means there's a lot of things that need to be broken down and decomposed. Now, the things that need to be broken down could be there's a broken sewage pipe. It could be that there's algae, growing in the water, however that works. And so if you get this high BOD, that's bad, means there's organic pollution, things can't live in the water. And it's a really simple measurement, if you ever want to think about it for your IA, is you essentially measure the amount of oxygen in water and you put it in the dark for 5 days, and then you measure it again and see what's the difference, how much oxygen got used. You put it in the dark because you don't want photosynthesis to happen, because that's not indicating decomposition, okay? And then you can see you get you get different types of water quality depending on the parts per million of oxygen available. So if that should say 10 or greater. So 10 or greater, if that's how much milligrams it takes, then that's a really per per meter. That would be really, really polluted water with lots of organic materials. Okay, and here's the rest of the steps if you're interested in doing this for your IA. You can see here's the biochemical oxygen demand after a sewage pipe. So here's the water is running in this direction. And so you've got the plenty of dissolved oxygen. And then right after the sewage pipe, there's a huge sag in oxygen because all the decomposers are breaking it down, right? And as you go further and further down, then it starts to get better. But the biochemical oxygen demand, it doesn't take a lot of oxygen upstream because everything's happy, things aren't dying, don't need to be decomposed. But once you have this sewage in here, lots of stuff needs to be decomposed. So the biochemical oxygen demand spikes right here, right? So lots and lots of oxygen is necessary to break down all that sewage. And then as it starts to get diluted down the stream, that reverses with the oxygen. Okay, well, hopefully this is helpful and you can answer the rest of those questions on C6.